on there.
Yeah.
It is awful. It is awful.
I think part of it is that, especially having written these long books, or if you're thinking about this from a musical angle too, the time it takes to craft a really good piece that may be 3 minutes, 4 minutes long, or a chapter is months, years, I mean, to really get it right. And yet this tweeting is like, people are saying, I have the most brilliant idea every 5 minutes, and here's my 250 words. That in and of itself strikes me as like the lack of kind of slowness, thought, reflection. That's troubling for me anyway. So that's what I'm dealing with. I think these tours are less concerning to me. It's just about meeting people, and that's great. And I feel like that's my natural kind of habitat. But yeah, social media is not.
No, and then study wise, it doesn't really, like for podcasts, it doesn't really boost downloads.
No,
it's not the thing that really helps. So I mean,
what really helps,
dropping episodes and trailers and other podcasts, I think that helps. The New York Times helps a lot. Morning Joe helped. I got 10,000 downloads in an hour from Morning Joe. I mean that, and then for like a week, and then it trailed off. So I mean but that's like, I'm not going to get that. Maybe I'll get Morning Joe next time because I was on there, but I'm not going to get. New York Times features 3 podcasts a year, so it's like that probably won't happen next time.
They're such a gatekeeper. It's at times it can be frustrating because the power they have to basically pick winners and losers is kind of wild.
Yeah. But then it shows you, like, and as a band, we've learned we used to do everything, and we've learned like you're just burning yourself out. You just pick a few of the things that are going to make an impact. And I don't even think like late night television shows carry the weight they used to.
No, I don't think people are really watching it in the same way. I think if you're watching it just purely as like, I'm a fan of this show, not necessarily what the content is. We had a band come up here that a friend of mine asked me to go see. They were kind of a punk band, and I said, okay, cool, I'll definitely come out and support, and I showed up, and literally it was me and my friend. And I've been there before. I've been there as a book talk person. But there was a side of it that was a little frustrating from their angle. Like they hadn't done any legwork to like try and just reach out to maybe like the university or whatever, like just assume people were going to show up. And it's like, y'all know no one here, and you're just getting started. And they left, one of the folks left before the other band went on, and it was like, you got to at least stay for the other band,
at this point. Yeah.
Exactly. Like we're losing numbers fast. And so, that's the way I feel about these small bookstores. Like I really try, for me, it's in part not about me, but also like business for the bookstore. I want to make sure that there's people coming out. So I reach out to the history departments and things like that. So, but I'm looking forward to coming to Chapel Hill. It's been a while. So
man, I wish I was going to be here. It sucks.
It's okay. That's
terrible
all right.
Timing. Because you would have had one more person.
Maybe the only person.
I could probably not even get my wife, but at least I would be there.
I know. And these times are also, and now as a parent, I totally understand it too. Everyone's just like, especially as we go into summer, it's crazy. But actually there's going to be a nice little group of friends down there. So it should be fun.
Wait, how old's your kid, Bart?
I have a son, River, who's 5, and another son, Blue.
Yeah. Dedicated the book to him.
Dedicated the book to him, yeah. And so he was actually named after the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he has 2 middle names in case he wants to disown his hippie parents. He can go with either
Sinclair and Stanford.
Exactly. Actually, let's see, Boyd and Wistic. Wistic, I guess, is weird, but it's a Dutch children's story. It's like a bumblebee and a story that my wife read. So anyway, but yeah, they're driving us ragged right now. We took them down to Atlanta with us. Took them to the festival actually with the big headphones. And
it's a rite of passage.
Yeah.
For little kids to wear those big headphones.
Well, and you've got the good earbuds in.
These are right. Yeah.
I was at the show. I was just reminded of how I've never worn protection when I've been in this, and I need to start doing that. It just wasn't a thing when in the 90s. It was like you just went.
You just got deaf when you were 30. You know what I'm
Well,
saying?
if you're
You
going to
just
punk,
got-
if you're going to punk shows, you better wear ear
Exactly.
protection.
Exactly.
Well, cool.
All
I
right, well, let's-
apologize for the errors earlier. This computer's going nuts, but I had to just clear a bunch of stuff off of it. So we are good now. We are good. You guys ready to start?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
I'm Ben Sawyer.
I'm Bob Crawford, and this is the road to now.
Yes, it is.
Today, our guest on the road to now is. Let's do it again.
I was like, dang, they've got this down.
By the way, Bart, episode 272. All right.
All right.
I can't believe it.
I'm Ben Sawyer.
I'm Bob Crawford, and this is the road to now.
Yes, it is. And this road is now twisting around for the third time, I believe, because today's guest is Road to Now favorite, Bartow Elmore. Welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me. This is my favorite stop on any tour.
You're sweet. Well, we're happy to have you back. And, you know, in one of the early spots here for your new book, which has just come out, Country Capitalism, in which you look at 5 American firms. And I said to Bob after when you came back on the second time, because the first one we had, you wanted to talk about Citizen Coke. And the second one we had you talk about Monsanto. And I was like, Bartow Elmore is a historian I know who seems like he wants to be assassinated more than anybody I've ever met. Like after this, he's going after the Italian mafia and like Putin's dynasty. But in this book, you go, hey, I made it through the first 2. Let's take on 5 at one time. And the book is called Country Capitalism. And in this, you identify the South as your point of focus. And so I want to open up with this general question. What is country capitalism, and why is the South a distinct region worth separating from the American economy as a whole?
Yeah. Well, you nailed some things. Another friend of mine said, you know, Coca-Cola might say, why are you so obsessed with me? Because I come back to Coca-Cola in this book as well. You know, I think to answer your question, I have to go to the personal journey, which is I went off to study the history of the American South at the University of Virginia. That's what I wanted to do. And weirdly, you could argue that these first 2 books, they have connections to the American South, the book on Coke and the book on Monsanto. But they were diversions in a way into environmental history, this other field that I found when I went to grad school. So for me, in so many ways, this book was coming home. You know, it was the book I think I intended to write when I went off to grad school. And to your point about why the South, it came from my own personal experience of going north for school and having this kind of odd experience of being able to see your hometown and place from outside. I went to school in New Hampshire and had this experience of people having all sorts of myths and partial truths about where I was from, you know, and I mean, I remember one time, I swear this is a quote. I mean, maybe I'm misremembering, but in a kind of heated exchange, somebody said, you know, enlightened ideas never come out of the South. And I just remember thinking, I get where you're coming from. Like, I also see the troubles of Jim Crow and all the problems in the South, but like, that's not the South I know. You know, this South is way more dynamic. You know, it's not a field of cotton fields and oh brother, where art thou? It's something else. And so for me, that's what the importance of talking about the American South for me is about rejecting this view that this is a place where kind of the national sins can go to die. Well, but for the South, if we could just lop it off, well, the rest of us would be fine. If we can see the ways in which our economy is kind of embedded in the South, that we're all part of this story, good and bad, that to me needed telling. And I felt like the textbooks didn't do a good job of that. So I wrote a book to try and get at that.
All right. So you wrote about Coca-Cola, you wrote about Monsanto. Why this book now? Why these, I think it's 5 companies that you cover. Why these companies, and what story are you telling here?
Well, it was an interesting choice to try and figure it out, what to write about. You could write about KFC, you could write about a lot of different companies. I kind of intentionally steered away from agriculture, which I'd written a lot about, because I thought that was part of what people think of the South as, you know, and I thought, while that's critical part of the story, tobacco, among other things. So many great historians have been writing about that. To me, it struck me that retail, logistics, aviation, the South had something to say. I mean, Delta became Delta Airlines, which is named after the Mississippi Delta, which most people don't know, because it was a crop dusting firm that serviced cotton farmers in the South, became the largest airline in the world. So, not trying to cherry pick here, it's like the biggest airline. So how did that happen? And what was it about the South that made that happen? Walmart, the leader in retail for sure, but like the largest corporation on the planet, by the end of the 20th century. To me, these were big. And, of course, Coke, like I need no introduction there. Bank of America, which had California roots as well. And I try and grapple with that, but ultimately be headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. Why did it become one of the largest banks in the world? And why Charlotte? These were things that had been unexplored, in my opinion, by historians. And I think it contributed to this argument that, well, the South's kind of a backward economics play, in terms of economics, a backward place. And therefore that explains kind of what's going on with all this, the social ills of the South. What if you told this story together and recognized that economic progress was completely compatible in many ways with some of the most retrograde social institutions of our time? To me, that's a lesson that we can all learn from. And so that's how this book came to be. Now, one other thing, and I didn't answer because Ben asked a good question. He said, country capitalism, we might as well get it out of the way. When I looked at these case studies of these businesses, and FedEx was part of that too, because I was trying to suggest that really a logistics revolution came out of the South, whether we're talking about banking and finance or retail, that it turns out that the rural nature of the South really mattered. And I didn't intend this to be the argument of the book, but when you looked at all these companies, what you saw was like, okay, well, what's the common thread? And it's that they all had to figure out how to get people, goods, and capital from and into these small markets, like really small towns. Think of Coke, like you can get it into the smallest little corner store. And that was something that kind of united all of them, whether they be Bank of America or Delta or other companies. They were all servicing the countryside. And I started seeing that popping out of the archives, that like they saw rural countries, rural areas, or even smaller towns as an asset, which to me was like, again, another intervention. Like we think of capitalism as coming out of the cities, or like Pittsburgh Steelers and all this kind of stuff. And that's in part true. But it turns out that like figuring out how to get a Walmart store in a town of 5,000 people means you have to build a satellite system and communication network, like the most advanced systems of our time. So rurality to me was the key ingredient. The countryside, country capitalism, was part of what united all of them.
And we should add here that the 5 companies that you address here in the book are Coca-Cola, Delta, Walmart, FedEx, and Bank of America. It is fascinating because, I mean, one of the things you start off with, and you address this up front, and then you come back to it at the end, is this idea that like this Amazon economy is something new. And when you break down what is Amazon, it's ubiquity. It's like instant, like click and receive no matter where you are. These structures, they're built on top of an infrastructure, of a business philosophy, really, that was established by these companies you look at. So could you explain that a little bit more?
For anyone listening to this podcast, this is the reason why people like me say this is one of the best stops, because read it and dig in, and we get to the meat of things I want to say. And sometimes that doesn't happen on podcasts. We're like, please, let's get to the main line. And that to me mattered. Like, the Amazon economy, I put in quotes, as you say, because, and the thing, Ben, that's so intriguing to me is if you go back to Jeff Bezos's writing, which I have done and really did at the end of writing this book, which is what makes me feel even more confident about the argument, he explicitly names these companies and says, I could not have built Amazon but for, and he says, FedEx. He actually names FedEx and says, but for this air express delivery system that came out of Memphis, Tennessee, where this guy, Fred Smith, was trying to figure out, how do I get to the small package market and ship things fast overnight? And he figured it out. You could not have had a company that now delivers our packages overnight, or in sometimes 2 days, to our houses. He explicitly says Bank of America. He says the credit card in his own personal writings. He said, I built Amazon on top of this credit card. Well, who was the first business to do that? 1958, the first commercial bank to issue a credit card, Bank of America, 1958. And it took off across the nation. And think of it now, even Visa, you have your own Amazon cards, folks. You know, you look down there and you see that Visa symbol. Visa was the computer system, what was called base one, that allowed for transactions to be cleared within the Bank of America system. It then became this kind of own brand that they could then sell to other credit card companies. So even on Amazon's card itself, you can see Bank of America's presence, Visa, on there. And the last thing I'll say about this is Walmart. If you look closely at Bezos, he read Sam Walton's biography. He flew to Bentonville in the 1990s. It's all fine and dandy to say the internet came and he just was all about Silicon Valley and it's the Seattle story. But that's not true. He went to Arkansas and poached his initial people from the Bentonville network to build his distribution network, because he didn't know how to do that and he knew who did. It turns out these folks in the South did. So, and this is, it sounds like I'm telling a glorious story. I do want to suggest that this book also shows why this is problematic. It's not all good, but I think we've really missed the logistics revolution that came out of the South that inspired someone like Jeff Bezos to do what he did, and really to even build the infrastructure on top of that in so many ways.
So with this click economy, this Amazon economy, it's environmentally destructive. And
yes.
So each of these companies has a serious footprint, has its foot on the neck of the environment in its own way. Talk about that and talk about what each of these companies claim they're doing to mitigate that.
Two great questions. And the first I'll take by just going back to Coca-Cola, which opens the book. We kind of, I opened that because Coca-Cola's whole model was to, as Robert Woodruff put it, make Coca-Cola available within arm's reach of desire. What a line. Within arm's reach of desire was Woodruff's line. I think they succeeded. I can't reach it right now, but that's maybe my own choices. But Coke's pretty much everywhere. And in this,
but you can reach a water bottle, because I see three of them. I see four of them now.
There'll be a Coke vending machine in your office once this airs,
hey,
Bart.
Hey, Bart, are they student water bottle? I know when I send my kids to school with a water bottle, they don't come back. And then when I go to my son's wrestling match, there's like this cardboard box right in the front of the school with like 100 water bottles in it. Is that what that is?
Listen, Bob, you have outed me. If this comes out and this is not edited out, my wife's now going to know where all the water bottles are, because she keeps saying, like, don't we have water bottles? Mm-hmm. And I can't. The funny thing is, until you mentioned that, I was like, yeah, where are all the water bottles? They're all right around me. So anyway, reuse is, I guess, what the message here. But you know, in this thing, I started looking at something I hadn't looked at before. I actually said, okay, well, what was Coke's big footprint? Given that, and part of the story is about that ubiquity, you know, and about that desire for immediate consumption, trying to point out that when we think about sustainability, we talk about new fuels and things like that, but confronting these basic logics of the business, which is like, you've got to be able to get a cold Coke, not just any kind of Coke, but a cold Coke at every turn. That's that arm's reach of desire, ability to drink it immediately. And I really dug into that. How does that create a culture that in the long run creates a huge environmental impact? And so I focused on the refrigeration story, which, you know, if you think about Coke, what's the biggest greenhouse gas footprint this business has? You might think it's the trucks or the factories and plants, but it turns out their single largest greenhouse gas contributing component of their system is refrigeration. It's about 35% of all their greenhouse gases comes from just trying to keep Coke cold in every single little corner store and market around the world. And so in this book, you know, I had the pleasure really of sitting down with the chief sustainability officer of Coca-Cola, who was the chief sustainability officer when I wrote Citizen Coke, my first book on Coca-Cola. Now, at the time, and I don't know why, they didn't talk to me. about Coke's environmental footprint. But he had left the firm and was willing to talk. And it was really a kind of blockbuster conversation because he revealed things that I think were pretty telling. But we had this conversation and I said, one of the things that Coke has been doing is trying to get rid of the refrigerants that they use in their coolers, which traditionally have been hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which you might think, well, how big of an impact do those things have? Well, they're 1,000 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And by the way, for the folks listening, you go check out your air conditioning unit at your house or wherever you are, you're going to see it's probably HFCs. And this is a huge problem because the global warming potential of these chemicals is through the roof. And so what Jeff Seabright, who was the chief sustainability officer, did was try and get that HFC out of these refrigerators for Coke. And I try and point this out. This was a good story. Coke was really leading the way, trying to change to something good. But in the end, you've still had this huge footprint from all their refrigeration units. And the thing I posed to him, and I'll shut up after this, was I said, hey, why can't you, have you ever thought about just kind of confronting this arm's length from desire motto and maybe not having things cold in every single market that you're in, like reducing the availability of just cold Coke and having it available to drink, but not necessarily like immediate consumption. And I mean, the response was like immediate and swift, as you might expect. He said, no, of course not. That's just not what we do. And I kind of wanted to say, well, maybe you should think about this. Like, if you radically want to reduce your greenhouse gas footprint, this is your number one thing. You've already changed these refrigerants and it's still super high because of all the electricity to these refrigerators. Maybe you really need to start thinking about not what you put in these refrigerators, but like, do they need to be available? It's 24/7, 365 days a year at the 7-Eleven at every corner store. Questions that I think are worth confronting. I think they're challenging, but I think they're worth thinking about.
Yeah, there's I'm trying to think how to get all this into like coherent questions here, but I think the way I'll start with it is throughout this book, you demonstrate, and this is what I love about your work, Bart. You're even-handed, right? I mean, you give credit when it deserves to be given, and you point fingers when they need to be pointed. You do point out that like within Coke's culture, like the people at the top of the company do care about these things. You point out in all these stories the impact that activism actually has. With Coke, it's Greenpeace. They work with Greenpeace to do this. And this is a case where you could say, well, the people who run the companies do have prerogatives. They do care about things. They're not inhumane. They're not monsters. And so they do actually care about these things. But then they're always up against profitability.
Yes.
And a lot of people go, "Oh, these corporations are changing," but if I'm correct in all these stories, efficiency will matter, but the market simply won't work that out because that's a certain cap they'll hit before it hits profitability, and they'll stop.
Exactly. You nailed something that's so important to me, and I want to tell two stories to illustrate why I think you're right on. When I write these books, I envision, and I've literally even put lines in these books that say, this is for you folks that are inside this company that I know aren't evil folks trying out to ruin the planet. Because I've met you. Jeff's one of those people. I believe he cares about trying to fix things. And so two stories. One is after I came on your podcast last time, we had been talking about Monsanto and Bayer. And I got an email from the executive, the senior vice president of the company, in my inbox. Now, at first, I thought, okay, here comes the subpoena that you were talking about. Better than a bullet, but I still was a little worried. And he said, "Look, I've read your book. It's hard to read all this, being a part of this company, but I've learned a lot. And I know this is up to you, but I'd like to meet." And over the last year and a half, I don't want to go into all that story because we're talking about something else now. We've been meeting. I flew to Germany. I met with people inside the company. And I can hear people on the podcast saying, "Oh my gosh, he's been co-opted," and all this kind of stuff. Look, I went in very skeptical, of course, and like, what are the intentions here? What are the goals? But I'm keen on, in a society that's so fractured right now, having conversations, and recognizing that history and the podcast work that you're doing, that if we listen to the facts of the past, we can create a better future, and believing that there are people that want to do that. The unfortunate thing, as you mentioned, is that I think the profit motive can cloud judgment and decisions, and trying to kind of point that out in times in this book, I think really matter. And the last thing that I wanted to hit on was what you said. There seems to be an obsession with efficiency inside these companies, measuring their success based on efficiency. And one of the terms that's being used a lot now is carbon emissions intensity as a way of measuring companies' success as they approach climate change. And what carbon emissions intensity is the total revenues of the company over the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they're emitting. Now, the problem with that is, the other way around, greenhouse gas emissions over revenue. The problem with that is, well, if your revenues go up, well, guess what? Your greenhouse gas emissions can go up. And what I'm seeing inside these companies is like they're using these metrics of efficiency and they're kind of patting themselves on the back. Look, we had a 30% reduction at FedEx of our carbon emissions intensity. But when I do the calculus and do the whole greenhouse gas emissions, it's going up. It's going straight up. And so
plus inflation is going to, sorry, I got to interject.
Yeah.
Inflation is going to change these numbers on its own if you're measuring it to revenue.
Absolutely. You could even just say like that dollar amount, if we're thinking about the basic math here, that denominator is just going to go up. So your greenhouse gas emissions can go up. And so one of the goals, and why I'm mentioning it here on your podcast, is I want to blow up these greenwashing terms, not only for us as consumers. So when we see them, we know that they're not what they say they are. Carbon emissions intensity is not telling you the whole story. But also for the people inside the company. If you're looking at those charts and patting yourself on the back after that sustainability meeting, dig deeper. Be the one who says, okay, but what about our absolute emissions? And some companies are doing that, but you can see this kind of carbon emissions intensity, this efficiency watchword being a distraction from the real work we need to do inside these companies.
So what would be that balance of profitability and environmental sustainability? Where is that sweet spot?
Well, interestingly, I think the Walmart case in this book shows that they go hand in hand. That really what made Walmart in the early 2000s, they committed to creating what was called a sustainability index. If you can believe this, the company committed to trying to trace the environmental footprint of every single product that they sold on their shelves. And you're saying Walmart? And here's that trying to be even-handed. Like, yes, Walmart, they were actually out in front as a retailer saying, we need to radically rethink the environmental footprint of our company. But what's interesting, as I document in the book, is if you go back to that decision in 2004 to committing to the sustainability program, H. Lee Scott says it point blank. I didn't really care about the environment. I cared about the bottom line. And what he saw was that when you did things right by the environment, that in fact you were saving lots of money. The classic example he gives is there was a box that held a bear, a little teddy bear that they would sell, and it was a massive box. And just because of the size of it, it took up so much space in the container ships, but also all the space in terms of the cardboard. And they figured out, well, why don't we just ship it, either not in the box or like this? And they reduced it radically, saved millions of dollars in all this cardboard. So it turns out that there are ways, I think, to see this as the future of these businesses, to be that profit and the planet can kind of go hand in hand. I also think there are times where a company has to make the hard choice that something may, in the short term, cost more, but in the long run, this is going to be both profitable and also something good for the environment. But I think Walmart's an example where people are recognizing that if you really commit hard to sustainability, you can actually see some huge savings and in ways that can really yield benefits.
Yeah, and I think that's good to put out there. I think, Bart, I'm gonna push you on this. All right, because I think whether or not it's good for the environment is incidental.
Yeah,
it's great when it works out like that, but when it doesn't, then it's going to be a problem. And this is one of the things that I was reading this book. There's an assumption built in, and I think an actor in this that's not named is that you talk about companies, but at the end of the day, these are all corporations. And I think we don't draw enough of a distinction between those two things, because a corporation is beholden to its shareholders. And everybody I know looks at their portfolios and go, how much is it worth? The company, like that you make Coke with the money that I've invested in this company, is incidental. I gave you money because I want more money back. And I wonder if you think there's a way, like, to acknowledge that, number one, in all of this, and number two, a way to change the terms so that actually profitability is linked to footprint on the environment.
Absolutely. And I think you could argue that this is not just in some ways, this book is not just directed at the people inside the companies. It's even more directed at the government agencies, the regulators, the citizens who vote for those politicians who create those rules, to say, you've got to put firm rules in place to address some of these issues, because this volunteerism that we're seeing inside these companies. So I gave the kind of good example of Walmart making some good choices, but those changes still aren't making the difference that we need. And I think that comes back to this being really a book about the failure of regulation, the failure of rules, especially in finance. What was so startling when I got to Bank of America was thinking about climate risk in our financial system, and the fact that for the most part, we had rules about predatory lending and things like that, but like you could just lend to whatever you want. Mountaintop removal in Appalachia, where I grew up, great. Wait a minute, like, why, if we're going to say that something is dangerous to our society, predatory lending and in terms of mortgages, why don't we have provisions in our finance laws that say, well, we also think that if you lend to this, it's going to heat our planet in ways that are dangerous. Fortunately, what's happening right now is that's what we're engaging in those conversations. How could the Dodd-Frank Act, for example, be changed to provide the kind of rules that say, you want to invest in this really dirty process? Here's the penalties for that, or just say you can't do that. In some cases, I think it'll be really interesting to see. And what was fascinating about this is, on this journey, I got to meet with Hugh McCall, who was the CEO and chairman of Bank of America. For anyone who's in North Carolina, you've probably heard Hugh McCall, because as I saw when I went to Charlotte and met him in his office, he looked out at Charlotte, and I don't know whether he said, look at my city, but you might as well have like assumed that was kind of how he felt. Like, this was the city that my bank, which used to be Nations Bank in North Carolina, but became Bank of America in 1998, when it gobbled up this California bank. He really believed he helped to make Charlotte what it is. And I sat down with him, which, by the way, if you ever get to sit down with Hugh McCall, it's quite an experience, because he just has grenades everywhere in his office. I think my first question was, are these grenades live? And he didn't answer. So like, I'm going to assume no.
You didn't think this is the one that's going to kill me. I knew I had to get to one of them, and it's Bank of America.
Yeah, as my mom had said, that you're going to get snuffed out. I thought this was the moment I was going to get snuffed out. But like, interestingly, when you sat down with Hugh McCall, he was more complex, and I think part of it is he's in his 80s now, and I think he's reflecting back on things. But we had some actually tearful moments where he talked a little bit about kind of coming out of Chapel Hill. He graduated from North Carolina, and he'd been a Marine, and he told me the story I'll tell here that I think is worth mentioning. Like, he had basically been surrounded by Jim Crow segregation, and had not really questioned it very much. But he was dropping in, I guess, on some kind of, training, and they had tanks on their back, scuba tanks, and the regulator and stuff were coming up the top. And he jumped out of the helicopter, and he knew he was falling too high. The altitude was too high on his drop. And so when he hit the water, his head went back, and it cracked it open on the back of his scuba tank. And he said, it was kind of like this red line going down, where he was just sinking and probably going to die. And I'm sitting there talking to him with the grenades. And by the way, this kind of bravado at the beginning in my city and all this kind of stuff. And I could just see him. He just kind of stopped, and I think I was just taking notes. And I kind of looked up, and I could tell he was crying, and he was getting emotional. And he told me, he said, that guy saved my life. And it turns out it was a black soldier who had jumped in after him and grabbed him and pulled him up. And I don't know if that was the beginning in his story. In his story he was telling me, it seemed like a kind of origin story of him beginning to think about social justice and how could banks be a part of that. Not that they always exceeded at that, and you'll see that in the story.
No, but I should say here, I want to interject. If anyone listened to a conversation with LaShonda Mims about lesbian culture in Charlotte and Atlanta, I mean, Hugh McCall is an unlikely hero in being the one who spoke out and supported the Pride events in Charlotte when the city turned against it.
Right. And you see, so that's why I think if there's any lesson for aspiring historians here, listen to your people. Don't come in and just assume that, the grenades are the whole story. There's probably more to it. And I really did try and listen to him. And that leads me to this point. I mean, I pushed him on this. I said, hey, Hugh, like what? So how do we change this whole banking on climate stuff? I mean, obviously you have trillions of dollars of assets in this bank that could make a huge difference. And he basically said, like, we need rules. Like, climate change is real. You're an idiot if you don't think climate change is real. But his problem was, if you don't have across the board rules, then guess what? If I, as Bank of America, choose not to fund whatever it is, fracking or whatever it might be, well, Wells Fargo is going to come in and get that business. So, in some ways you hear at times, and I've been writing about this a little bit, that businesses might want to welcome a little bit more if they really do care about the environment. But by the way, it provides them cover from conservatives who are attacking them right now and saying, oh, you're being woke and you're doing all these things. Well, if there's a rule, they can say, look, I'm following the rules. This is a rule that's in place, and I'm doing that. So I think in banking, the problem is, and in finance, that if we don't create these rules, you're going to have bad actors and good actors. The money's going to flow until you say, we're going to have some kind of system that says you can't do this. And I think even Hugh McCall, even it's people inside the company intimated. I don't think he was saying straight out. I don't think he could find himself saying, I want to be regulated as a bank. But that's basically what they're saying, because I think it makes sense too, because of your point. Otherwise, their objective is to do their best by their shareholders. And if they can make more money doing something else, they're going to do it. So I think this is a story in part directed at financial regulators to say, how do we embed climate risk more effectively in our financial regulations so that everyone's playing by the same rules? I think we could have big effects if we did that.
So each of these companies, though, comes from a state and a section of the country that is traditionally or typically against regulation.
Yes,
they're all Memphis is a blue dot in a sea of red. You've got Charlotte, slightly blue dot, and I will argue with anyone that North Carolina is a red state. It is not as purple as people think it is. Georgia is having a blue moment, but it's not really a blue state. Maybe it's on its way. Maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
So, Arkansas, there's no blue dot.
Right.
So how could we expect these companies and their corporate headquarters to make these altruistic decisions when the representatives from their state wouldn't support the regulations that you say can help?
It strikes me that we're at a moment where maybe corporations can have a reckoning with this kind of government is the problem, it's not the solution kind of logic. I think I butchered Reagan's quote there, but that what's like, take Florida, which we've left out of the story a little bit, and Disney.
Please.
What's happening? What's happening right now is they're getting attacked not by liberals who are upset about everything, but there are legislation that's coming after what businesses can and can't do because they're being seen by folks like DeSantis as being too woke, etc. It turns out that this kind of let us run the show, let this all be kind of corporate volunteerism, has backfired in a way. It's brought in more government, not just from the liberals who are saying, wait a minute, you're not fixing your problems, but from conservatives in the very states that were supposedly going to be anti-state, saying, no, you cannot invest in ESG. indices and things like that. I mean, these are very firm laws that, by the way, are like very restrictive, like the exact opposite of what we've seen in the 50s and 40s, which was to say, do what you want with your money, come what may for the environment and come what may for society. We're seeing interventions coming precisely because these corporations didn't want government there. I think that's a lesson for these businesses that, it turns out that having some rules that you can hide behind and say, look, I'm just following the rules, might be a good thing in some of these states, if they really
Bart,
want to be woke.
You are hanging this notion on. Gary, help me out here. You're hanging this statement on a notion that people understand nuance.
That's true.
And nuance, along with shame, are the two greatest casualties of the early 21st century.
Yeah.
I saw a quote from Bob Iger today, the head of Disney, saying, well, do you want our jobs and taxes or not?
Right.
And it sounds like, they're pushing there. Ben, it's your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. I just think it's remarkable. And second of all, well, we'll go back to this. The answer to that question is the federal government, and this is why you can't rely states to regulate themselves. I mean, it's a race to the bottom. I mean, I don't mean that on everything.
And the other thing I'd say about this is, if the argument is we want the federal government out, this book is a story of how none of these companies would exist but for the intervention of the federal state at every single turn, right? So the idea that you leave us alone because we've done this all on our own is blown up in every chapter, because you see the federal state being one of the key ingredients that makes all this possible. So the idea that don't bother us because we haven't asked for anything, that's just not true.
Well, yeah, the federal government sponsors Coke during World War II and allows them to requisition supplies without any of the caps, because a lot of their service is to foreign, to the military, and then leaves hundreds of Coke distribution centers all over the world. You've got Arkansas, which will not Arkansas, but Walmart, which will roll up into a local community and basically pass the costs of the infrastructure off to the local people, which is, to me, I wanted to go on with this list, but I want to stop right now. This is the problem. I mean, going back to this question of why do people care about consumer credit, predatory practices, but there's no caps on these other things? I mean, go back to Liz Cohen's Consumers Republic. I mean, we've been convinced that we're individuals, right? And that somehow only our impact on ourselves is and perhaps our impact on immediate others is the thing that actually matters. When in reality, I said it best, like they had these bikes at App State when I was there, the community bikes, and they kept on disappearing. And people were like, well, of course that happens. I was like, not of course that happens. I was like, the problem with this situation is there's two ways to look at this. You could look at this, anything, the environment, right? The air. You could look at it as this belongs to all of us. Or you could look at it as, that ain't mine.
Right.
And the second one is the way that we've come to think about it. And I wonder if you have any ideas on successful examples where people have been able to change that mindset to thinking about this belonging to all of us.
I don't know. I'd have to think about that more, but I do have a response to what you're getting at, because I do think, and you see this in the conclusion and the introduction, that I had a moment where I had to kind of reckon with myself in this book, and I think we all do as historians. Like it's easy to say, and this is going back to being a humane writer in the sense of not just trying to give the full range of human emotions to the people that you interview and talk to and listen to them, but also to interrogate your own embedment in the story. And I can't see a solution to the problems we've talked about today, but for us, as you said, Consumer Republic and Liz Cohen, confronting our own consumer expectations. I mean, none of this changes but for us kind of questioning our own immediate need for gratification when it comes to this stuff. Like, it may be that some of the solutions involve us getting an Amazon package, a little not as fast as we get it, or having that cold Coke available at arm's length in every street corner. That kind of ubiquity of immediate consumption and expectation of that is something that I think all of us are going to have to confront as consumers. It's not to say that business has a very adept way of trying to get consumers to feel guilty and to see them as the only way to fix problems. Like, if you just picked up that litter, then we'd fix our recycling issues. So I'm not trying to suggest that. As we've talked about in this podcast, this is structural. You can't change this stuff but for rules and because I've seen it. I've been inside these companies and I've watched it. Here's a stat for listeners I think is like worth like sitting with for 5 seconds as we think about climate change. Bain and Company consulting firm in 2020 did a study. They looked at the top hundreds of companies at the top of the economy, and they surveyed their promises when it comes to sustainability. And they looked at the success rate at meeting those promises. And do you know what the success rate was? It was 4% success rate on meeting the promises made in the past for we're going to get net zero by this date or whatever. So when you see stuff like net zero and you're saying, I wonder if they can do that. What this data points to is that you've got a 4% success rate. I tell my students, I say, if 96% of the questions you got wrong on this exam, do you think you'd say that was success? I think you'd have to say you failed, And I think, but to me, that's where rules come in. We've watched corporate volunteerism play out in sustainability over the last 30 years when corporations started taking this stuff seriously. The pace of change, 4%, is not going to cut it. And that's why I think this book is suggesting ways that you could put pressure. And by the way, I think it's pressure on these types of companies. Most of our laws, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, 1970s, they're focusing on industrial firms because those are the giants of the day. Control the smokestack. And I'm glad the EPA is doing that today. But, the clean water coming out of the effluents of pipes. Yeah, but Walmart now runs the show. These conduits of capitalism, Amazon. How do we create new rules that target these giants of logistics? And if you can change the veins of the economy, well, wow, maybe you can cut off the problems before they even get there in the first place. That, to me, I think is we have a role to play. The expectations as consumers, as you said, I think thinking through what that world's going to look like, maybe we have to make some adjustments to what we expect. But we have to put these rules in place because we're watching corporations telling us they've got it covered, and they're doing it at a success rate of about 4%.
Hey, Bart, doing business history, really hard to get at documents and access to primary sources. Certainly if you have another field of study, another focus, it might be a lot easier. Which of these companies were the most open and which were the most closed?
Well, I'll tell you a little trick for folks that worked out. I just played around with FedEx's email algorithm and just happened to get Fred Smith's email. And just so that Fred Smith, by the way, who's the founder of FedEx, I'm not going to say it on air, but I will tell you, it's a pretty simple system that they have. And sure enough, good old Fred Smith just wrote me back.
Are you saying it was Fred Smith at FedEx.com?
No, I'm not. I'm not.
And his password is 12345.
Just not going to do it. I'm just going to say what I said. But it's and it was interesting. That led to a really important interview that led to the opening of the book, and which was even more interesting than I was able to capture, I think, even in the preface. But because he linked me up with Richard Smith, who's his son and who's been doing some pretty interesting things. And there again, another kind of give and take, the COVID crisis and how instrumental FedEx was in getting vaccines to people and everything else. So, but I've learned those things over the years. I think that the trick is just always knock. I tell my students, knock and show up. That has taken me to the headquarters of Hugh McCall, and it's taken me to the chief sustainability officer of Coca-Cola. You'll also Delta allowed me access to their records in their museum, and that was kind of interesting. A lot of corporations are very closed in terms of what they give access to. But I'll tell you, I'm headed to Bentonville, Arkansas next week.
What?
And
so is this the next project?
This is a chapter of a book that I'm working on, and Bentonville, Arkansas, the headquarters of Walmart, I have yet to crack that nut, so to speak. So I've decided I'm bringing a mountain bike. I'm headed to Bentonville, and we'll hear more. The story that you see in Walmart was really, in this chapter, was really built on archival resources, kind of traditional techniques of history, which is great. As a historian, sometimes you can lean on finding archives, usually what you're doing is looking where the company is operating and then going to their historical society and seeing what they had. And it turns out that there's rich archives all around the country of towns that were upset with Walmart coming in that had huge collections that detailed that. The story, of course, I detail in this book is of Ben and Jerry's Williston, Vermont, which was a great story, and that I didn't expect to find. And I got to interview again, and then triangulating from there, I interviewed the people inside Ben and Jerry's and got their perspective on what was going on. So I think the main thing I'd say to any, especially younger or graduate student or somebody that's doing this, is show up and knock on the doors. I think I was shyer, and I also didn't think anybody would open the door when I was younger. And what you find is that people want to tell their story, but you have to do it right. And I think the Bayer response to the book is where you want to land, in the sense that, like, if you do this right, people that are inside the company, and I think this guy is a good guy inside Bayer, you know, they will read it and understand what you're trying to do. They'll see that it's not filled with modifiers like the greedy company. You don't have to say greedy. Show it. If they're being greedy, show it.
Thank you.
You know, you don't have to tell it. So
you should teach a class or something.
Yeah.
Well, I imagine some RTN folks are like some great budding future Pulitzer Prize writers, and if I can give something to them, I have not won one, so maybe they can. I think these are key tips.
This show has a way of making them, Bart.
It sounds like it.
It's the point where we have an obligatory shout out to Jefferson Cowie for winning the Pulitzer Prize.
Congratulations, Jeff.
Go back and listen to that episode where we talked about his book, Freedom's Dominion. And
we should actually re-air that.
We should, but I'll say this. I always try to be careful in not Chris Farley show conversations, right? Where I'm just like, it was so good. And I thought it was going to be easy because Jeff's a buddy of mine, but I still kind of did that. And I feel validated now.
Yeah.
But exactly. He's also, it's like good. Bart, they're professors, and you have to, you're trying to like put your best foot forward with these guys, because you kind of feel like you're in class. You know, if Jeff Cowie or Bart Elmore tell me that was a good question, I'm feeling good for the rest of the day.
Bob used to talk to me like that.
I think.
Hey, wait, Bart, I don't want to cut you off, but I want to say this before we're done, and then you hold that thought.
Yeah.
You know, I think of you as a journalist.
Yeah, I happily accept your invitation, and I will say this. I think I have at times taken some hits from people who will say that in an attempt, and I know you're not, to kind of say, well, you're not really a historian. And I just want to be a voice to say, this is the problem in some ways in academia, where it becomes about like, who's your tribe, and stay in your lane. And I think maybe because I was dyslexic and shouldn't be doing this in the first place. I mean, I had severe learning disabilities and probably shouldn't be writing books, that like I always had to put all the little skills I had and put things together and make it work. That I found that formula is actually the better way to go, which is to ignore those boundaries. And there was I'll give a shout out to Jamie Allison, his professor in Virginia, who was a colleague of mine in grad school. I remember I was struggling with this. I said, is this environmental history, or is this business history? Is this Southern history? And he said, who cares?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, well, how freeing, you know? Is it journalism? Is it history? Well, I'd like to think that I'm pulling from the best of both worlds. And I do think they're disciplines and they have unique things to offer, but why not, you know, cross-pollinate? And so for me, I used to be afraid of that, be like, no, I do archives. Now I'm like, I'll own all of it, you know, and maybe a scientist too, a little bit. I love spending time in the labs here. And, you know, and if we're not afraid of breaking down these boundaries, I think we go to great places. So and by the way, all the shout out to journalists. I've learned so much from you all, especially at New America. Great writers who taught me how to do this the right way. And because it can be scary talking to people. And the biggest thing I worry about when these books come out is just, did I get you right? I don't even care if I agree with you or disagree, but did I capture your voice the way that who you were? And I feel like when I do that, and I've gotten some feedback where people have said that, those are like the highest moments for me.
And it's why your books are so good, Bart, because I mean, there's the nuance, like Bob said, you know, a casualty of recent, like of recent American society. But it's like, who do you think? I mean, you might sell more books if you wrote some book that was like how these 5 corporations destroy America and are poisoning the future. Like that might sell more damn books, but like, come on, man, that's not the story. That's not the actual story. I catch my students in the classes when we talk about the Gilded Age, just like being like, well, these people did this, and it's like, okay, like they're not going. I mean, they're not Mr. Burns.
Exactly. And what do we learn from that? We learn from that we're not them, and therefore
Right.
we're not as vigilant in our own times for the stupid things we're doing, the things that people are going to look back and say, wow, can you believe they drove a fossil fuel car even though they knew for 20 years that this was heating the planet? We're all embedded in these tough worlds and decisions. We all make bad decisions, and I think history has made me a better wife, a better husband, a better father, a better friend. It's made me just be more self-reflecting on what I'm doing. And I think
you just got to work on wrangling those water bottles, Bart.
they are. I will.
Oh my God, there was
today.
another one.
Good
that orange
gracious.
one just came in.
We're gonna have to
I
put
didn't
this on
even
YouTube
see
so
that
people
one.
can witness this. And nobody's gonna believe how many water bottles you have, except for your wife.
Exactly.
Yeah. She'll be like, I suspected as much.
I'm like, honestly, this has been like some kind of therapy. I have discovered that I have a problem with water bottles. Thank you. Just for that in its own right.
And that's another thing about covering people in your stories. Sometimes they can't see themselves for what they are until they stand back and look at it from the perspective of good people who are willing to tell them the tough truth. I want to end on at least get to this before we end, because the thing I like about this, and I think why it's, you talk about corporations, you're like, hey, it's good for the economy, but also it's profitable, right? Like, in some senses. The thing that I always I've started leaving off of my students is saying a lot of dark things have happened in the past. There's no question about that. Look them in the eyes, understand that every single one of you could be the guy holding the club.
Mm-hmm.
We all have that potential. But you should side with the person on the ground and understand that the guy holding the club in the picture, like the civil rights movement, right? These folks beating people. That guy went home and had dinner with his kids, right? That guy's not sitting there as like an inhuman person. You got to wrap your head around it, and you got to get into the dark side of it. But I also tell them, like the last day, I say, there are a bunch of people who are going to tell you that trying to change things doesn't matter. There are a bunch of people who go, that's just the way it is. I was like, and they'll point to these dark moments, but when you look at the past, you are confronted with so many cases of people having the wrong decision right in front of them. And that's the easiest thing to do. And they chose not to. As much as people will use history or human nature, which is lazy, as an excuse for why things are bad, and they always will be, don't try to change it. You have now been in this class confronted with the power that people have when they decide to actually make a change, and now that's on you. And I think your book does a great job of showing that.
And then I think it's a and yet and the other thing we do is to call it out. I mean, there are times in this book too where people say, well, they didn't know back then. Well, they did know what HFCs were doing. I mean, part of our job too is to say, like, and that's happening in our own time too. We know what fossil fuels are doing to the planet, like we are in that right now. And in the same way that people in the 1950s and 60s knew that segregation, we had the Brown versus Boer decision as the Confederate battle flag was being put on the Georgia state flag, stuff like that. So we're not going to be able to hide by that any more so than folks did then. And I think it puts a little bit more onus on us to be a little bit more bold and a little bit more thoughtful in our actions. So I always joke. I say, people say, what are you going to do with a history major? I say, how could you possibly live your life without history? Like, I mean, how could you possibly, govern and make decisions and be a good citizen, but for the history that's offered in our classrooms here on this podcast and through, great books like Jeff's book and others who are helping us understand the past to be better humans. So thank you for the gift of being able to be here and share these stories, because you have a outlet that to us as scholars really matters, which is to reach people that might not be in our classes that we really want to reach. So as always, this was amazing. I really appreciate it.
Bart Elmore, visit number 3 in the books.
The book is Country Capitalism: How Corporations from the American South Remade Our Economy and the Planet. The author is Bart Elmore. You guys pick up this book, and if you like this, go back and listen to the other 2 episodes. Because, Bart, I had a student who started listening to The Road to Now, walk into class the other day and be like, "You mean Coke told everybody they were going to recycle the bottles, and then when they got the deal, they just didn't do it?" And I was like, "Yeah, you listened to our first conversation with Bart Elmore, didn't you?" He's like, "Yeah." Amazing.
Awesome. Well, that's such a treat. So thank y'all so much.
You know, Cowie got his Pulitzer after his 3rd visit. So I think it's coming.
That's a lot of pressure, Bob. I gotta say,
Charm.
3rd time's the charm.
If not 3rd, 4th, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank y'all again, and thanks to everybody out there for listening. This is great.
Thank you.
Well, you're a great historian.
All right, you are one of the best.
No, y'all make it easy because of how you do it. It really should be a New York Times featured podcast. So whatever we can do. Actually, we're meeting this afternoon with this publicity team that's gotten pulled in because of the Dan David Prize, and we're trying to figure.
Are you up for Dan David Prize?
I got the Dan David Prize.
What? How did we not know about this?
When did you get that?
I got that the first year it was released.
Okay, because we had 2 of their winners on this year.
Oh, amazing! Yeah, I was the first, Laura, the first round. It
look
changed
at you, Dan David Prize
changed
winner.
my life.
I didn't even say it. Yeah, dude, it's
crazy, man. I mean, I feel like y'all are friends to sharing. I mean, it was tough, man. Even coming out of grad school, we didn't have a lot of cash as one does.
Of course not.
And so like that changed a lot. I mean, Joy's parents have been in assisted living, and it's both of them. So just all that stuff. Anyway, long story short, yeah, they're incredible. But anyway, they've created this public relations team that's helping us get whenever we do stuff.
Joe DePlasco is probably a part of that.
There's Joe DePlasco, and then I'm working with Chris Pigot and a couple of the other people that's part of that team. Yeah.
Yes. Tell them that we said hello.
Yes,
well, and I'll tell them that we just went on, and so see what we can do, because they're doing a great job of trying to make. I think it's lifting all boats, which is what it's all about.
They are great. They are our guardian angels. They have been so good to us. I cannot even express how good they have been to us.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I really need to figure how to see you guys in person and have a beer and coffee or whatever.
That'd be great.
Let's do I won't be in North Carolina with you, Bob, but I did just found out I was going to do the Southern. I just got booked for the Southern Festival in Nashville.
Oh, when is it?
It's in October, October 23rd or something like that.
Right in downtown.
Dude,
3 miles away.
So that could be our Nashville connection where we make it happen.
Let's hang out, and if you want to, pocket some of that conference money, man, you can crash in my guest bedroom.
That could be amazing. I love it, man. I've always, Nashville's been a special place because it was close, to Atlanta, and I haven't been back in a while. So,
Bob, I just want to say this. That means that Bart Elmore, Ben Sawyer, and Jeff Cowie will all be in Nashville at the same time, and there's only one piece missing from that.
I will not be there. I cannot be there. I can already tell you right now I won't be there, but
didn't even look at the calendar.
Wish I could.
Yeah, the busiest man in showbiz.
Probably be at St. Jude actually that week.
Oh. Okay. Well, yeah, and I want to hear more updates on things. And look, Bob, the PhD invitation at Ohio State still stands, man. If you're interested, let us know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested. It just how would the work? How does the work integrate? How does work flow? How does the work?
I actually brought it up.
I got to run to a meeting with my son at the school. So
bye, Ben.
All right. See you, Ben.
I think we'd have to figure it out, but I did talk to the chair just kind of like in passing.
What'd they say?